I call the member for Durack.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I too rise to speak on an issue that is very close to my heart, the representation of Indigenous Australians at university. The desire to further Indigenous career prospects is a passion of mine, and I believe it is to be one of the few real, tangible ways to bridge the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, and I am pleased to hear that Labor supports this bill. The legislation we are debating here today aims to streamline the confusing and convoluted support system currently available to Indigenous students wanting to further their education post-high school. Any improvement in this area, Mr Speaker, is of course welcome, as the current system has far too many conflicting and overlapping guidelines to be practical and workable for young people attempting to study full-time. Mr Speaker, the Higher Education Support Legislation Amendment 2016 Measures No. 1 Bill 2016 serves two functions. Firstly, it creates a new section in the Higher Education Support Act 2003 so that existing Indigenous student assistance can be combined into a single division and managed under simpler and more consistent guidelines. Mr Speaker, it will also allow the Minister for Education and Training to allow his department to collect tax file numbers for the purposes of administering student assistance and managing information collected under the scheme. Mr Speaker, the purpose of these changes is to encourage Indigenous Australians currently attending university to maintain their studies and to complete their degrees. This will greatly improve their employment prospects and will allow them to advance themselves in the ever-changing Australian job market. Mr Speaker, as our economy changes, so will the requirements needed for entering it. As our economy moves towards a more combined resources economy and a skills economy, our workforce will need to be highly educated and upwardly mobile to meet the challenges facing it in the years to come. Mr Speaker, it is expected that young people in today's world will move through at least 5 different industries and take up some 17 different jobs over the course of their working lives, and I believe it is vitally important that we are equipping young Indigenous Australians with the skills and the qualifications to function in this new economic climate. Mr Speaker, that is why it is imperative that our job market changes, our policy towards furthering the opportunities for Indigenous students changes with it. Indeed, we cannot allow the disparity between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students to continue into the future, and this is why we have to change policy now to beat these challenges before they become too difficult to overcome. Mr Speaker, the Higher Education Support Amendment is intended to reduce the red tape and overlap that currently exists between the many different programs available to assist Indigenous students. The collection of tax file numbers is a good example of this, Mr Speaker, as it allows refunds and deposits to be paid directly back into students' accounts when rebates are available. Mr Deputy Speaker, tax file numbers are currently collected for all other higher education loan programs except for the VET Fee Help program. Deputy Speaker, this incompatible Labor policy will now be brought into line with the other higher education support programs, providing clarity for prospective Indigenous students. Deputy Speaker, this current practice unfortunately exposes vulnerable students to predatory loan services, coercing students to take out loans when they are neither required nor necessary, and leaving them without an avenue for compensation of their student loans. Deputy Speaker, this legislation will bring the VET fee program into line with all other current university fee help programs, simplifying the process for application for both the applicant and the governing department. Deputy Speaker, the intention is that this will streamline the process of accessing government assistance and will improve Indigenous education outcomes. Deputy Speaker, undoubtedly we as a nation have been successful, not successful in, well, let me start again. We have been successful in engaging Indigenous students with university and higher education. We have seen a 70% rise in Indigenous enrolment in university in the last decade, which is a credit to our higher education institutions around the country and the hard work of the Department of Education and Training, and of course not forgetting the Indigenous students themselves for taking the first step. Deputy Speaker, but we must now do more. Rather than simply getting Indigenous students through the door, we now need to work on bridging the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous completion rates for post-high school study. We want to ensure every dollar we're putting into Indigenous student assistance programs is working as hard as possible to improve the outcomes for Indigenous Australians. Deputy Speaker, we can no longer be simply content with creating Indigenous students. We need to be producing Indigenous graduates and leaders. This is a core facet of this government's election commitment to changing the way our economy functions and views itself. Deputy Speaker, with a dynamic, skilled and engaged young Indigenous workforce, we will take incredible steps towards bridging the gaps between the quality of life currently experienced by Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. This is an issue, Deputy Speaker, that I'm particularly passionate about. As Chair of the Standing Committee on Indigenous Affairs and as a member of a very large electorate with the third largest Indigenous population in Australia. Deputy Speaker, I'm pleased that the aim of this legislation is to simplify the guidelines, making the variety of supplementary programs available for Indigenous students more workable and more accessible. Currently, because these supplementary programs are drawn from different sections of the Higher Education Support Act, as well as several other appropriations outside of the Higher Education Support Act, a number of Indigenous students are unaware or unable to claim the support services they need because of the complexity required in obtaining services. Deputy Speaker, this is an issue that this bill seeks to address. Deputy Speaker, the bill will consolidate the Commonwealth Scholarships Program, the Indigenous Support Program and the Tutorial Assistance Program into one single body administered under a single set of guidelines. Deputy Speaker, this will make the application process far more streamlined and far easier to understand for potential Indigenous applicants. Funding will be distributed to universities based on their full-time enrolment, progression and completion rates of Indigenous students, as well as their share of regional and remote students. This is part of our election commitment to eliminate red tape and to allow services for Indigenous Australians. Deputy Speaker, it is imperative that this legislation be introduced now and be passed quickly through the House, thereby allowing universities to present Indigenous students thinking of studying in 2017 a clear indication of what government programs are available to assist them. It is therefore, Deputy Speaker, a matter of urgency. These measures are critical to allowing Indigenous Australians who want to further their education the best possible chance to do so at the earliest possible date, starting with the very next semester and the next round of university admissions. Deputy Speaker, when we improve the lives of Indigenous Australians, we lift up and improve all of Australia. Education is the key to closing the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. And Deputy Speaker, I commend the bill to the House.
I thank the member for Durack.